Hey, how's it going? So we're going to take a look at two more writers here. These particular ones will be Hawthorne and Poe. So as you can see, Hawthorne was born at the beginning of the 19th century, lived 60 years. An interesting thing about him was he was the son of one of the judges of the Salem witch trials. As I mentioned before, the Salem witch trials were an important part of American history and one of the great tourist attractions of Salem itself. Another interesting thing about Nathaniel Hawthorne was that he joined the Transcendentalist community at Brook Farm that was set up by Emerson, but then he became skeptical of it. And we'll take a look at this and how it works in a couple of slides ahead, how he criticized that. So here's a picture of him. You may recognize the portrait. I think this is one of his more well-known ones. Photographed there, I believe. So he published Twice Told Tales in 1837. This was a collection of short stories previously published in newspapers. And he has other collections too, but this is the one that stands out. So he wrote about New England Puritanism, and you can see this in the Scarlet Letter. So this is interesting because now we have, in 1850, he's writing about the past. So he's writing about something from the past. So, it's not reflective of the times when he wrote it. He's writing about, kind of almost a historical fiction here about before. And when we look at it now, we think, when you look at, like when we read, for example, The Three Musketeers, we're thinking about Dumas writing about, how life was then. But he wrote those in the middle of the 19th century, Dumas did, about the mid-17th century in France. So, we're looking back, but then the book is about something that's even before that. And that's what happened here also with the Scarlet Letter. Other famous works of his are The House of Seven Gables, the Blithedale Romance, in which he criticized the Transcendentalist movement at Brook Farm. This is the one I wanted to mention, where he really didn't, he wasn't really into the movement that much, so he wrote about that in that book. And The Marble Faun, which is a romance of different genres. And you can see there's a lot of different genres, Gothic, travel guide, fable, kind of mixed them all up in there. So, this is about the Transcendentalists. So he was disillusioned with that because, he didn't want to really ascribe to a particular doctrine. And you kind of see that there. He has a lot of different diverse styles and didn't want to really stick with one there in particular. So his use of allegory is important when the characters represent abstract concepts. And the idea of metaphors too with this writer is very important. So when you think about literary devices, it's good to keep this in mind. Some of his more famous short stories are The Birthmark, Ethan Brand, The Minister's Black Veil. Some of these are also reminiscent, and it's some things to look at. Like we said before, we should, you should take a look at what I'm presenting here, but go and do some more research and check out some of these short stories, and just to supplement what we're presenting here. So he has a backdrop, but there is a criticism there, and you can see this come out, for example, in the Scarlet Letter. It's kind of a dark romanticism. We've seen a lot of positive points of romanticism, the whole transcendentalist movement, and this upward idea of separation from, the separation from society through nature, very positivism. But there's a dark side to that too, and you can see a lot of that in his writings, and you can definitely see a lot of that in Poe. So in The House of Seven Gables, this was a novel inspired by an actual house in Salem, which is kind of odd. I used to own the house that was very perpendicular to that. And I look out my window and see the House of Seven Gables every day. But anyways, so this was actually inspired by the house. And you can go to Salem and you can visit the House of Seven Gables. If the same day, it's a very, very historical town. And it's just really neat to see that, as part of a literary work here. So this is a picture of it. The gable, I think, are these parts on the windows up here that stand out. So the story itself is about a house built by Colonel Pynchon on the same plot where Matthew Mall, an individual, was sentenced by him. So he curses the house, which has tragic consequences for the subsequent generations. And it's just kind of a picture of that, and you can see there's kind of gothic, dark romanticism. It's not really. It kind of has this idea of the guy looking out the window, long curtains, and dark image there. So years later, continuing what the story is about, the novel transpires how Hepzibah tried to support her brother Clifford when he got out of prison for the murder of his uncle. And so he was framed by Jaffrey Pynchon, who torments and threatens the siblings out of greed. And as the story goes on, he dies mysteriously, like the colonel did, and eventually the siblings inherit the estate and move out of the house. But it's, you get the story, and it's very, it's dark, and it has a lot of change from the previous romantic works we looked at. So in this story, there are also other characters. I had the romantic interest in Phoebe, romantic interest in Halgrave, and so on, the secondary characters. And you can see this whole idea of different levels of interpretation and different ideas. You can read the story just for entertainment, but you can find a lot of the romantic motifs in there that repeat themselves. So this book is a social commentary on the pretensions of people in power, like the colonel and the judge, and how they veered from traditional Puritan thought for personal gain. So there's definitely a social interpretation of this, and you can see that as these two main characters that kind of manipulate the lower characters and end up suffering in the end because of their greed plays about. Now, to move on to the Scarlet Letter, this is a book that many schools require. I think I read it when I was in high school a couple centuries ago. Just kidding. But yeah, so it's one of the books that he wrote. It takes place in Puritan New England in the 17th century. Like I said, it was written, in 1850, and it's retro. So when you read it, if you have read it, just remember it's writing about the past. So Hester Prynne, this is the storyline here, has a baby named Pearl out of wedlock and has to wear letter A. Obviously, that A is for adulterer on her front. But she won't reveal who the child's father is. And here's a picture of her. You could see under her, you could see the A here underneath the baby there. So Arthur Dimmesdale, who's Pearl's father, suffers from guilt and whips himself daily. And that, that's part of the Puritan tradition, self-flagellation to kind of repent. Hester's husband, Roger Chillingworth, returns and discovers what went on. So the three of them, Chillingworth excluded, wanted to flee, but Dimmesdale dies after a confession to the congregation, then Chillingworth dies, and at the end, Pearl marries well, and Hester stays in the cottage for the rest of her life, and she's buried next to Dimmesdale. So it plays out a lot of the same idea of, this a lot of the ideas of taking a lot of the Puritan ideas, maybe a criticism of the Puritan values at that time, because you could see the suffering of a lot of the main characters here on part of a lot of the other characters in the town. But at the end, the end here has it has a relatively good ending. But when they're buried, they have a A above their gravesite to always remember to the other people what happened. Let's take a look here at Edgar Allan Poe. Definitely one of my favorite writers. When I was, when I was younger, I used to read his stories, and very, horror stories. But he's very important in terms of the genre. You can see here he lived a shorter life, but I'll explain that in a minute. He's a writer of fiction, poetry, and literary criticism, but he's best known for his Gothic short stories. So it's interesting because he's kind of believed to be the inventor of the detective story. Very influential also in science fiction, and very influential in future the horror genre also. And if you've ever read any of his stories, you can see that in how he wrote. So here's a picture of him. He's from Baltimore, Maryland. And I went there once to see his, a little historical research on him. It's very interesting to see that. But so interesting fellow. Lived a very intense life of gambling and going out at night. So when he was in his upper 20s, he married a cousin that was 13, but she died a couple years later of tuberculosis. Very intense style. He's a writer that tried to make his writing his style of living. Like a lot of the poets, a lot of the writers they have such intense writing that they want to, sometimes the writing reflects how they live, or how they live reflects on their writing, and this reciprocal relationship is definitely, you can see this in Poe, very intense lifestyle, very intense writing style. So he died when he was 40, I think he was 40, he died, he was found dead on the street of Baltimore, and kind of mysteriously as he lived, kind of out of one of his own stories. So you can see he's very influential for the short story novel, the short story genre, and he influenced a lot of the later writers like Faulkner, Baudelaire, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Rubén Darío, Maupassant, Borges, Cortázar, and obviously writers of mystery later on like Lovecraft and Arthur Conan Doyle. So he's very influential, definitely a forerunner in the short story genre. To talk about one of his poems, one of his most famous poems is The Raven. And a raven is like a big crow. And they have the capacity, I think crows, they have the capacity to actually speak. One of the best birds for speaking, I think, is a Maya bird. And those are similar to crows, and and parrots and other birds speak also, but this is important for this story because of what's repeated in the story. So it's a narrative about a raven's midnight visit to a distressed lover, and how the lover kind of is with this raven and he's thinking about his lost love. It's just a picture here of a raven. Sometimes with the wings out, a lot of the time it's just kind of a premonition of death or a premonition of something bad that's going to happen. But the idea of black and a night visit and all of these dark ideas are connected to the dark romanticism. So the poem itself has a supernatural, mythological, and classical religious elements in it. So you can see a lot of influences of other types of writing. It has a constant repetition of the raven saying nevermore, nevermore, nevermore. So that's that word that the raven would repeat. And it becomes kind of like this motif, staple in its meaning. No, that's not going to happen, nevermore. So, this kind of drives, it drives a man kind of into his state of mental instability because of that. So the narrator wants the raven to leave, but the raven just stays where it is. And it kind of concludes there that its soul will be trapped there forever. So you can see here in this particular slide, and the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out of that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So you could see the nice rhyme scheme in there, and the way it flows, and it's a very nice poem, and I suggest you go back and take a look at the entire text. Shouldn't take too long to go over that. But Poe is mostly known for his short stories. These are some of his most famous short stories. The first one here is just really scary about how he closes the guy in the wine cellar there. The Pit and the Pendulum, that was one of my favorite ones. The Murders in the Rue Morgue also when I was younger. The Telltale Heart. If you haven't read some of these, I suggest you take a look at some of them. Not just for the test, to catch up, but just also because they're just very interesting works of literature. But he's also, like I said at the beginning, for his literary criticism, he wrote a popular essay entitled The Philosophy of Composition, which is sometimes cited, so you might want to take a quick look at this too, and used in class. So one thing that's interesting to Poe about the short stories is He said that short story or writing is an art that should be enjoyed in one sitting. And this would, when you read obviously when you read a novel, you're not going to sit down and read a 900-page novel in one sitting, but probably not. But if a short story is something that can be enjoyed in one sitting, and this was connected to Poe and one of the genres he's most known for.